One of the things I want to address is the whole issue of mind control techniques and how this applies to what cults do to control and manipulate their members. And one of the best things that I've found is the information provided in Robert J. Lifton's book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, that was published, the research was done in the 50s, and it was originally done with a focus on prisoners of war and the Chinese re-education programs. And what they did is they went in and they interviewed people who had gone through the re-education programs and took a look at what techniques were used to change people from behaving in one way or thinking in a certain belief system into adopting what the present propaganda was, and in effect controlling what they thought. And out of the research, what he was able to pull out there were 8 major techniques or criteria that were used to control people's minds and get them to change. And it's really interesting to see how these 8 criteria can be used to take a look at how cults control and manipulate their own members. The 8 criteria initially are milieu control, mystical manipulation, a demand for purity, confession, sacred science, loading the language, doctrine over the person, and dispensing of existence. And what I'll do is I'll go through each one so that you get a better idea of what it is as Lifton defined it, and I'll see what I can do about applying it to how cults use it, and specifically how the cult I was in, the Jehovah's Witnesses, use it. In milieu control, there's an attempt to control the environment, who the person talks to, where they go, who they see, what they do. There are very often rules about who you can see and who you can't, and who you can talk to. You can talk to members, you can't read certain information, only certain things are allowed. For example, in the Jehovah's Witnesses, there are very strong sanctions against reading what they consider apostate material. An apostate material would be anything that criticizes their own beliefs. You're not allowed, for example, to talk to ex-members, people who have left because there's possibility they may have read some of the apostate literature and then tell you about it. There would also be a lot of controls and rules about not participating in certain activities. So one of the things that a lot of children who are raised in the Witnesses, for example, experience is they're not allowed to participate in extracurricular activities. They don't get involved in sports. They don't get involved in activities outside of the home. Most of their activities are within the organization and boundaries of what is allowed. And it's made very clear what is allowed and what isn't. The second criteria is mystical manipulation. And in this, a group that is trying to use a mind control technique will encourage you to believe that their thoughts and beliefs are higher than anybody else's, that they actually have a higher power, that God is instructing them. And it becomes very difficult for a person who wants to believe in God and wants to follow what God says to say, no, this is separate from God. So if the organization or the cult can convince you that this comes from God, it adds an extra power to it that isn't there if somebody says, well, it's just the boss that says you have to do this. And by that, they're adding a spiritual element, and cults tend to very often use the spiritual element, or higher powers or God, to reinforce their belief systems that these come from God. In the Witnesses, what they do is say that the Jehovah's Witness organization, Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, the governing body of that organization is the only medium on earth that has the power or the information directly from God in how to interpret the Bible and how to pass that information on to their members. And if as a member you think that this is the only way to be accepted by God, then they have an extra pull in authority and control over you. Another thing that they do is the demand for purity. There are a lot of rules about what you can and cannot do in behavior. How you dress, what you eat, what you wear, where you go, how you comb your hair. It was interesting as a witness that at one period of time men were allowed to wear only white shirts. And then they kind of relaxed the rules and men were wearing colored shirts, pastel colors. And then they kind of went, no, you can't wear that. And they were back to the white shirts. Women was always what they considered conservative dress, so skirts around the knee. It didn't matter how cold it was in the winter. Women were not allowed to wear pants when they're in public or going from door to door. And in this way, it didn't really matter what was best for the person, but it was appearances. And so this demand for purity more often addresses the needs of what other people will think rather than the needs of the members of the group. And so the individual gets lost. And about 5 years ago, I went with a girlfriend to an assembly, and just to show her what it was like. And we walked out of there, and she was like, "I can't believe it. They all look the same. You know, all the men are dressed exactly the same. All the women, the dresses are different, but the styles are all the same." And she was just flabbergasted that individuality gets lost. But the demand for purity also goes deeper in instilling a lot of fears about the devil, about being ensnared by people who are non-members of the group, that they may entrap you or encourage you to move away from the organization. There's a lot of guilt that is implanted. And this is interesting because the witnesses will say they're not a cult, but any cult will say they're not a cult. And one of the things that a lot of groups say is, well, we're not a cult because we don't follow people around. You know, people are free to come and go as they please. They've got jobs, they've got lives, they live in their own homes. But the very subtle nature of mind control is that they don't need somebody following you around to monitor whether you're following the rules or not. They teach you to monitor your own behavior and your own thoughts. So you become afraid of doing things because somebody else might see you, but also afraid of your own conscience. And a lot of this is that you don't want to have a conscience that will bother you. So you start obeying all of the rules that they have set in place so you don't feel guilty. And it's not a guilt about, well, I've done something wrong. It's a guilt that somebody else has imposed on you. And, you know, whether I have my skirt an inch above my knee or an inch below my knee, this is not a big sin. And yet they can make you feel like it is. So you're constantly checking to make sure that your behavior is okay. Another way that this gets acted out is a lot of people these days are into garage sales. Witnesses are really encouraged not to go to these, because you might get something from somebody's home that is contaminated by demons, and therefore wind up bringing that back into your own home. So you become afraid of accepting things from other people. You become afraid of influences from outside, so you limit how much TV you watch, you limit what you get from other people, you limit what you read. Everything becomes, your world just gets smaller and smaller, and the smaller it gets, the more difficult it becomes to have a full life and to be an individual. The next criteria is confession. And one of the things that what happens is when a group instills this fear of guilt and shame in you about doing certain things, and then the only way to relieve that guilt is to tell somebody. And the people that you often tell are the elders and the leaders of the cult, or the elders in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses. And very often this in itself is a very degrading experience. A lot of questions about very intimate details sometimes that are really unnecessary to, in fact, I doubt it if priests ask as many questions as elders do. And this is supposed to relieve you, but what it really does is give them more information to use against you. And then later on, that information will always be kept. In fact, they keep records of what you do and what you have admitted to. And it's always like a shadow over your head. The fifth criteria is a sacred science. And again, this comes back also to a little bit of the spirituality, and that their power comes from God, or authority comes from God. But it's also the ideology, not just the authority, but rather that what they believe is God-given, which again makes it very difficult for people to break apart from it, because God says this. So there's always, no matter what you say, it's, yeah, but God says this. And as soon as you introduce an element of mysticism or spirituality into something, people have no or very little ability to fight that and to say, yeah, but there's something fundamentally wrong. For example, at one point while I was a witness, they changed policies drastically and then back again. We were never allowed to speak to ex-witnesses, people who'd been disfellowshipped. And they at one point said, well, there were certain circumstances where we could talk to ex-members, and which was a really great relief, because we had an uncle in our family who'd been disfellowshipped, and we couldn't talk to him. And when they changed the policy and said we could, it was like, wow, this is so wonderful, this is great. We can now have, even a, superficial relationship with them. And I think what happened is that a lot of people started talking to ex-members and finding out a lot of information that was not allowed to have. And so they changed the policy back again. And the explanation of this was never very clear, except it comes from God. There's no way to fight that. And if you believe that the governing body is the messenger between man and God, you have no way to argue. And saying anything different is generally squashed, or you're accused of doubting, and then you're kind of under suspicion. The sixth criteria is loading the language. And the rationale for changing the meaning of words is that it creates a unity in the organization. What it really does is separate people from the world around them. And examples of loading the language, door-to-door service, kingdom ministry, kingdom hall instead of church. There are a lot of terms like this in the organization that amongst witnesses themselves they can use with great flexibility, and it's not a problem. But when they try to communicate with non-members, they have to define all of these terms because nobody else understands them. And when cults use a technique like this, it's used to separate people from the greater community and make them different. And if you make them different, you can make them feel special, which will want them to stay. But the detriment is that it damages people's relationships with the greater world. The seventh one is the doctrine over the person. And again, this comes back to, it doesn't matter how individual circumstances or a situation is, no two people are the same. No two situations are going to be the same. And what they try to do in a cult is uniformity, and very often called unity. But it's really uniformity, that it erases the individuality and everybody has to become the same. And if God wanted us all to be the same, He would have made us all the same. But there's such wonderful diversity in people that we need to be able to celebrate that, not squash it. But when you have doctrine over the person, a situation will come up where you were judged based on a rule rather than on the circumstances involved for that situation. The last criteria is dispensing of existence. And in cults, it's like basically what they say is, if you are within the group, you are saved. If you are outside of the group, you are not. And they define who is inside and outside of the group. Therefore, if you commit something or break one of their rules, you risk being expelled from the group, and therefore you are no longer saved. And as long as you obey all of the rules, then you can remain within the group. This instills, again, a lot of fear about breaking rules. So your membership is no longer about love of God or a love of doing what is right. It becomes about fear of breaking rules. And then a lot of guilt if you do something, because there are so many rules. It's like nobody could possibly obey them all. And that this fear and manipulation that is used, again, is an added control on people, so that you're controlling what you think, what you do, the knowledge that you have, the information. And when a lot of groups will use one or two of these on occasion, of the 8 criteria. Unfortunately, groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses use all 8, and they use them all the time. So that people do not have free will. And one of the things that I was looking at was this whole issue of consent, because people say, well, people choose to be in a particular group. People choose to become Jehovah's Witnesses. But there are 2 things that are required to consent to anything. One of them is that you have to know what it is that you are consenting to. And the second thing that you have to know, you have to have the freedom to say yes and no. And without that freedom to say yes and no, then consent cannot be given. 2 of the things that are required for consent and to explain why people join, or whether a person has consentingly joined a group. The first is that person must have full information of what is involved in the cult. And the second is that they have to have the real freedom to say yes and no. And the reality is most cults do not fully disclose all of the rules to prospective members. Very often it's on a kind of need-to-know basis. So they wouldn't say to somebody, well, if you join the Jehovah's Witnesses, you'll never be able to celebrate holidays again. And if a family member leaves the group, you'll never be able to talk to them again. Given just those 2 examples, most people would say, forget it. The fact that there isn't that full disclosure, a lot of people are basically manipulated into thinking they're joining something different than what they actually get. And the other thing is, with all of the guilt and the rules and the idea that all of this information comes from God, then the person is not really free to say yes or no, because they're led to believe that what they're saying yes or no to is not an ideology or a belief system, but rather God Himself. So, penalty for saying no to God to somebody who believes in God and wants to do what's right becomes irrelevant. They no longer have feel that they have a choice to say yes or no to this. So very often what you have is a lot of people who are involved in a movement who believe that this is not a cult and do not see how they've been manipulated. And that's part of how the mind control techniques work, because they're so slow and subtle that a person doesn't realize how they're being taken over. There are a lot of effects of this kind of control. And very often people who have come out of cults begin to recognize the effects. But you can also see it in active members of a group. And there are several stages that people go through and in recovery. But even while people are in a cult, they lose, first of all, I mentioned earlier, their identity. They lose their individuality. But they also lose their ability to think. And this has been taken a look at by a few different people. And what happens is if a group is constantly feeding you the same information over and over again, after a while it becomes it's boring. So people wind up sitting there and tuning out. And the more you tune out, the easier it is for all the mind control techniques to kind of implant themselves in you. And it becomes more and more difficult for the individual to challenge those thoughts. So, like the information about my uncle who was disfellowshipped and we could talk to and then we couldn't, and you don't say, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. You just accept that that's the way of things and that the information just changes and grows and new light and all of this. And there's no saying, well, wait a minute, how come it was this way and that way? This isn't a progression anymore. We're going backwards. And even thinking about that is condemned, to think that, wait a minute, this is not the way it's supposed to be. But people are so programmed not to think that these kinds of thoughts rarely enter their mind. And if they are, they're kind of pushed down. So thinking becomes difficult. Being able to reason things out becomes difficult, and this transfers to their general lives. So very often people drop out of school, but as they're becoming witnesses, they'll leave school. It's too much of a challenge because their mind is slowly shutting down. A lot of people become depressed, and there have been some things that I've read where depressed people become witnesses. Or people from difficult lives become witnesses. But there's also some information coming out about people, once they have joined, they become more depressed. And part of this is the loss of individuality, the loss of dreams for what they had planned career-wise. As a child, I wanted to be a therapist. And as a witness, that would have been totally inappropriate. And just continuing to, when I was in a witness, it was not encouraged to go on to past high school. So my career dreams were washed aside. And again, that dispensing of the person and person over the doctrine, that their needs come first. When people begin to come out, they begin to experience a lot of psychological problems, a lot of depression, a lot of anger once they begin to realize how much control that existed over their lives. Very often in the stages of people accepting their own death or the death of a loved one, there are certain stages that people go through, and they're very similar, interestingly, to the stages that individuals go through in recovering from cults. And very often one of the first things is disbelief. I know when I was disfellowshipped, it was shock, total and utter shock that this had happened to me. I think I wandered around for months in just shell shock from it. The anger didn't hit for a long time, but very often people get angry that how could they do this to me? And then very often a depression will set in. A lot of people commit suicide. And sadly, this is covered up because that control of information that they have, they don't let people know that when somebody has left the organization and committed suicide, they don't want anybody to know that there's a connection. And they'll say, well, it was anything else except how they were treated. Very often people go through a bargaining stage, or they'll try to well, maybe the organization wasn't so bad, maybe it was me, maybe I can go to meetings sometimes. So there's this whole period where people will kind of, maybe can have 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and they'll try that, or they'll say they'll just go back. A lot of people find that because of the language control and being separated from other people for so long, they find it hard to reintegrate into the world. So they kind of figure it's just easier to go back to what they knew, and they'll go through the trial periods and get reinstated. And then some people will either accommodate to an living outside of the organization and just kind of still believe what the organization taught but not want to live it. And some people will be able to have full acceptance of the experience and heal towards, yes, that was a negative experience, but I can still grow and move past it. And it's a very difficult challenge for people to move through these stages, because very often they've been told for years that there's something wrong with them, rather than there's something wrong with what they've been taught. And especially if they've been taught, again, this information comes from God, it becomes more and more difficult for a person to believe that it's not them. You know, it's like, well, me or God. And the organization, in the case of the witnesses, kind of winds up being lost in there. And yet, they're the real middlemen that are controlling everything. It took me 10 years after coming out of the group to even begin to read any information about Jehovah's Witnesses and their mind control techniques, or even anything at all about them that was negative. And a lot of people will say, well, then it couldn't have been so bad because, you know, you continued to believe it for a long time and, you know, you went off and lived life. And my response to that is that the mind control techniques are so strong that even after leaving for 10 years, they still had an effect. And that's how powerful mind control really is. That even years, decades after leaving, a person can still be under the influence. Yeah. Well, what will happen for a lot of people is, well, if God has expelled me from the organization, then I must be a horrible person. And people will live up to or down to the reputation that's put on them. And so a lot of people will just go out and live the life that we were told ex-members lived. It becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy, and we act it out. Not all do, because some actually are able to go on and live, you know, kind of not go in that direction. Probably more of rebellion than anything else. But many people follow that route of drugs and alcohol and all of the things that the witnesses said would happen if you left. And then they can stand there and say, see? and the person says, well, you see, they were right for throwing me out. In reality, the drugs and alcohol and just misabuse of yourself is just a self-inflicted. It's the anger turned inward instead of out at the organization, which you've been taught is out towards God, which is not allowed. You turn it inward and you die inside. And it takes a lot for people to begin to move into taking a look at what happened, because there's so much fear put about it. It's like you're getting, you know, basically aligning yourself with Satan if you start reading anything about the organization. It's becoming what they said you would become, which would be useless. So there's, and going to church for the first time is a real challenge, because you're entering Satan's house, basically. And people have tremendous fears years and years after leaving, because the techniques are so strong. Not because this was, just a simple choice that people made. It took me a couple of years of reading material after the 10 years, and then another couple of years of reading, before I had the courage to go into a church. And even then I went with like a friend on each side, because the fear of, being struck dead by walking into a church was so enormous that I felt like a cripple. But the interesting thing is, when I came out of there, and I was scared the whole time. I just sat there the whole time going, oh my God, God's going to see me in here. The more I went, I came out feeling free and light, and lighter than I ever had before. And it wasn't like, my girlfriend tried to say it's because God has, blessed you or supported you or whatever. I don't know how I feel about that. But I think what it was releasing all the bounds that were around me, that were chaining me down into thinking that walking into a church was such a horrible thing, and that I was such a horrible thing for having left. The reality is, I still believe in God, and I don't think that I really believe he understands what I've been through and will support me. Don't know how he does that, but but I felt free of the chains that had held me down for so long. And that where I lived, there was a staircase, 100 steps. I never used to be able to run those 2 at a time, but after this experience and being set free, I was running up those stairs 2 at a time. I had energy because I wasn't using all of my energy to hold me down. And I think that's something a lot of people experience when they get this sense of freedom from all the chains that have been put on their minds and their bodies, that they have more energy because they're not using it to keep themselves restrained. So there are a lot of benefits of allowing yourself to be free and looking at the information. One of the challenges I found was that as a witness, you're told not to talk to ex-witnesses. The interesting thing I found was that as an ex-witness, I still believed and followed for the 10 years that rule not to talk to ex-witnesses. So here I was, an ex-witness, still not talking to ex-witnesses, which is what I really needed to do. I really needed to talk to other people who had left and to find out that life can be good after being in a cult. And it can be wonderful and freeing. And those rules just kept me chained for another 10 years. Because if I had managed to see that I could to talk to other ex-members, then I probably would have been freer a lot earlier.
Yeah.
I do know that my children, who were raised up until they were 8 and 12, they were raised as witnesses, that they had nightmares. I remember reading the children's book to them, and the pictures of, bodies piled up, and actually that wasn't a children's book. I think that was some of the Babylon the Great books, and that was kind of scary for kids to think that, if they didn't obey, they would wind up like a dead carcass, and for the birds picking over their bones. So they had nightmares over that. And that's, I think back, what a horrible thing, an image to give to young children, that if they don't obey, they're going to be, raw meat for the birds. And I can definitely see how that would have a much stronger hold on a child's mind to conform to the rules. And it makes it understandable why people who've been raised their whole lives as witnesses have a much greater a more difficult time breaking free because there's all really heavy-duty fears planted in there. I know as an adult I didn't allow myself to think about those issues, but here I am reading it to my children, and they're a lot more susceptible to those kinds of fears. There's some theoretical responses to it. One is that some of the founders were extremely dysfunctional men. And one of the things, when I was looking for information on cults and Jehovah's Witnesses and some of their mind control techniques, my background is psychology, social work. I found nothing, absolutely nothing in the literature on this kind of information. And I was everywhere I tried. McGill University is a pretty big university. I figured for sure I would find something there, and I found nothing. Somebody put me on a different tack, and I started discovering religion and researching the religious aspect, and that's where I found the information. And unfortunately, there's very little crossover between psychology and social work or counseling and religion. And one of the things I would like to do is go back and get my master's, because there needs to be a crossover there where the two, you can begin to see the psychological impact of something that comes from religion. And it's extremely strong, it's extremely powerful, and it has barely been touched yet. When I was looking through the research, I was looking under abuse in psychology and social work, and couldn't find anything. And then I managed to go into religion, and I found the information on cults. And what I was able to discover from this is that my background is in abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. But psychology doesn't deal with that. Religion deals with the spirituality. And when you put the two together, you see the dynamics are the same, identical. Whether it's a group or a husband or a parent over a child, abuse, the techniques are the same. And by putting the two together, you can begin to get a greater picture of what abuse does to people. And what you begin to see is that people who have been abused and suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, well, people who come out of cults experience what has been defined as post-cult trauma syndrome, which is basically the same thing, with a spirituality element to it. And we need to do more research in this area to be able to kind of get a broader idea of just how this works. But people very often coming out will experience all of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Spontaneous crying, a loss of self, which was actually taken away. There's a huge sense of loss of all of the things you could have done with your life but didn't get done. Very often people become extremely suicidal, very depressed. There's that fear of not obeying the cult's wishes and all of the rules. It maintains itself. Plus this fear that God is going to destroy you. There's a sense of isolation because now you're isolated from the world because you've been in the cult for so long, but now you're isolated from the cult because they've thrown you out or you've decided to leave. So that means that nowhere do you feel a sense of belonging, which we all need as humans. There's a tremendous amount of loneliness because of that, because you're not allowed to speak to ex-members, you're not allowed to speak to members. You've been forbidden for so long to speak to people who are out. It's like there's nobody left but you. There's a fear of the evil spirits taking over your life or the demons, attacking you. Very often there's panic disorders that develop because of all of the fears that have been implanted. You begin to think you must be going crazy because this is just so much. And there's nobody to talk to. And even if you go for therapy, very few people are going to understand it. I went to a therapist. I was able to talk to her, but I knew it was way over her head. She didn't have a clue what I was talking about. And at that time, I was already a counselor for abuse survivors. So I knew enough of the theory to know where I needed to go with this, but I was not getting any help there. And at one point I talked to a minister, and he didn't know any of the issues of abuse. So no matter which side I went to, there wasn't any real support or understanding for what I needed to do to get through this particular healing process. I mentioned the disbelief and the hostility and the anger, and those are all parts of the post-traumatic stress disorder in trying to put your life back together and understand what has happened. And a lot of people, in coming out of any kind of abuse experience, one of the initial things they want to do is just say, just put it over on the side, I'm not going to think about it. So when people will go off, and I went off to school, and other people have gone off and done, all kinds of different things. But it's like, I'm not going to think about it. And then 10 years later, I had to start thinking about it. And you're kind of like, what took me so long? And again, you're feeling negative and the guilt and the shame because you haven't been doing this work, or you haven't gone back, or you haven't moved forward. But eventually you begin to take a look and say, I need something in my life to replace all of that. But I have to look at what that was and who I am today. And the nice thing about the time that it takes people is sometimes they've managed to develop some skills and a sense of self that they can begin to take a look at and kind of get the mind thinking again, so that they can begin to take a look at how shut down and closed they became while in the group. I still have, my mother's still a group member, and it's a challenge sometimes to kind of say, like, is she better off in or out? So, and she's older. Would she really, benefit by coming out? What kind of a life would she have? Because those of us who have come out know what a challenge it is, and so you kind of debate, which way to go. Very often, too, when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, people have flashbacks. I had flashbacks. I know the first few weeks I wasn't out there knocking on doors. Saturday morning I was up, I should be out knocking on doors. I should be doing this. Or in the summer, everybody's going to the assembly, I should be off at the assembly. And so all of these kinds of things kind of flash back. And they become less frequent, but occasionally they still, something will trigger a memory. And people think, well, this means I must want to go back. And really, flashbacks are simply a reliving of the experience that was so ingrained in the individual and just needs to be not just kind of pushed on the side, but taken out and looked at. And how did this affect me then? How does it affect me now? Not only in what I believe, but in how I feel. Because one of the things that cults do is they limit your feeling. You're not allowed to be too happy or too sad. If you are, like, for years, I hid my depression. And people need to be able to learn how to feel again, how to cry again. For years, I never cried. And I cried after I left. Let's go with the abuse, because I think it sets up what made me so vulnerable.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because I think that's really important for a lot of people. It's amazing, how many people admitted to me that they had been abused before they became witnesses.
Yeah.
And these were, while I was a witness, people, my friends, almost, I'd say about 80-90% of my friends had been abused before they became witnesses. And this sets up a particular dynamic for the love bombing. And it's like, I think that's important to bring out.
Excellent.
My first 10 years of life was extremely abusive. We were not Jehovah's Witnesses, but in the first 10 years I experienced a lot of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. When I was 11, I had been living with my father. At 11, I went to live with my mother, who was studying with the witnesses. So that was my first introduction to the witnesses. And during the 1-year period where I was living with her, her boyfriend, who was also studying with the witnesses, was sexually abusing me. And there was a lot of physical and emotional abuse going on there too. And as a consequence of her finding out about this sexual abuse, I was sent into foster care. Now, I'd had 1 year of going to meetings and going from door to door and the witness life. And I was sent into foster care, and I was not allowed there to speak to witnesses or have any contact with them. So here I was in an environment where I had no contact with the witnesses, but the interesting thing was that I continued to behave like a witness and to believe that if I did that, then God would approve of me. So I went to school in grade 8, 9, and 10, not participating in extracurricular activities, not standing up and singing the anthem, not participating in any of the holidays. So basically doing all of the things that witness kids did. And the interesting thing was that there were a few witness kids in the school who didn't have a clue who I was, saw me sitting out in the hallway like they did, and never approached me, never talked to me, never asked why I was doing all the same things they were doing. And it was the most bizarre situation. And yet, here I was doing all of this and not having any contact with witnesses at all. And I look back and I think, wow, that 1 year in a child, 11 years old, was strong enough to implant that for 3 more years. At 16, I went back to live with my mother, and within a year I was baptized. And another year I was married, and a couple more years after that had 2 children. And the marriage itself was imposed, and I would even say arranged by my mother. She was very anxious to have me married and out of the house, and I guess so she wouldn't be responsible for me anymore. But also there's tremendous fear on her part that I would have sex outside of marriage. So there was, don't want to break that rule. So she got me married as quickly as possible. And to somebody who was baptized a week before I married him. So a really new convert. And he was very enthusiastic, and within a few years rose up through the ranks and became a ministerial servant and eventually an elder. And one of the things about any authoritarian group is that the people at the bottom have no power, and children and women have no power. And since he was moving up through the ranks, ministerial servant and elder, he had power, and he used it to control us, to abuse us. He beat the children, and of course the explanation or excuse for justification for that was that it was Bible-based, that he should beat his children. But his beating involved also kicking and punching. And they were little at the time, and I would try to, get in there and pull them out of the room. And sometimes I was able to do it, and sometimes I wasn't. And I didn't like it after growing up in that kind of environment. It was really hard to stay there. But one of the things, when I went back when I was 16, here I had been a child who had been abused badly most of my young life. I had been shipped off to foster home and had no contact with my brothers or any of my family. And when I got back at 16, I was welcomed with open arms into the congregation. It was like they remembered me, and I think for the first time in my life I had a sense that somebody cared that I was around. And that's a really powerful drug to somebody who's been abused and abandoned. And what I found with a lot of people I knew is they also had abusive backgrounds. And by joining, by no means not all witnesses have this kind of background, but a lot do. And by joining something like the witnesses, or any cult for that matter, getting this sense that people care about you, that you're special because God has blessed this group, that individuals, like when I went in, the first meeting I went to, one woman grabbed my hand and said, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you. I've missed you. I remember you so well." It was just like somebody finally covering me warm blanket and saying, "You're home. Welcome." And it was like water to, a man in the desert. It was wonderful. And that was such a strong hook for me, and I think it is for other people too. And it's a hook that keeps people there. Because even though once you become a full-fledged member, a lot of that disappears, there's always, once you've had it, there's the hope that if you can be good enough, you'll get it again. And it's only because you've got all these negative thoughts in your head and you're not doing everything perfectly that you're not getting it. So it keeps you working harder and harder to strive to get that sense of acceptance and belonging. And this is an abuse dynamic. And this is why women stay in abusive relationships. It's also why people stay in abusive cults, because there's this constant kind of dangling the carrot that if you're good enough, you will get everything that you've been promised. And unfortunately, you never get it. You're on the treadmill, and you're running and running, and you're told you're still not good enough, and so which keeps you working harder and harder. And it becomes it's extremely manipulative, but it's a dynamic that is really difficult to break out of because you don't realize what it is, especially if as a young child, that's all you ever knew. And so for people who were raised as witnesses from childhood, to them this is perfectly normal. And we gravitate towards what's normal. And that's why I think a lot of people from abusive backgrounds will enter into cults, because to them this is normal, which is kind of sad. So from there, so I'm married. I have a couple of children. My husband is an elder. He's abusing us. He's using the Bible to demand sexuality on demand. I was trying to deal with the abuse from my childhood, and I had a husband who was abusing me sexually. It was overwhelming. I became extremely depressed and suicidal. I felt like there was no way out. When I married this man, 2 weeks later, I realized I'd made a horrible mistake. But because they don't believe in divorce, I was stuck, so I tried to make the best of it. And I stayed for 15 years and just got more and more depressed until daily I was thinking about dying. I even started making arrangements, talking to people, will you take care of my children if something happens to me? I was kind of trying to set it up so that I knew who my ex-husband would marry, so that they would have a mother. I talked to people and in case he didn't marry, will you be there for my kids? And I was working on making plans to commit suicide. And I just realized I didn't want to die. I wanted to be free. But the only way to be free was to either die or commit adultery. That was the only way away from this man. And I just knew I couldn't go to the elders with this. He was one of the elders. And my experience with men to that point had been really negative. So there was no basis for me to believe that they were going to support me. So I actually met somebody, and I had a sexual experience with him that turned into a rape. And being the victim and sexual abuse survivor, I felt it was my fault. I didn't even recognize it was rape for about 3 years when I started doing some research on date rape, and then it was like, oh. But it took me a year to tell my husband that I had committed adultery and that I wanted a divorce. And he said, oh, I'll forgive you. We could go on and it's like, I'm not going through all of this just to be forgiven. I want out. But being out, getting a divorce meant I also had to leave the religion because I didn't see how I could stay and be a witness and get the divorce. So my option was get the divorce, then he's free. Another big, huge dynamic in here was that my husband was always threatening that if I didn't provide sex on demand, he would commit adultery and it would be my fault. And this whole issue of blood guilt that they instill in people, that if a wife does not fulfill her sexual obligation to her husband, if he commits adultery, then she's responsible. So forget his responsibility in this. She winds up being responsible. And therefore, God will condemn her. So to let him off the hook, in my very warped kind of thinking at the time, I figured, okay, I'll commit adultery, then he's free to remarry, and then I won't be guilty if he commits adultery. And that way I only have my own blood on my own head and not his. So this to me, other than suicide, seemed like a rather reasonable alternative. So that's the route I went. And then once I told him I had committed adultery, it was bringing the elders in, which was a humiliating experience. The questions were in detail. When I finally told them that it had turned into a rape, they didn't believe me. And they said, well, if it was rape, then you're not free to marry. And I was like, well, I was there. I did, go down this route. And it was just really awkward and uncomfortable. A lot of details they really didn't. All they needed to know was that it happened. And I wanted my divorce. I got my divorce, and then, of course, had to leave the witnesses too. One of the other things that, in doing it this way, he knew that I was going to tell the elders that I had committed adultery. And here he is. He's an elder in the congregation. Everybody's looking up to him, and like he's counseling people on their marital lives. And outwardly, I made it look like we had the ideal family. And people would say, oh, you have such a wonderful family. When I get married, I want a family just like yours. And I would want to be sick, but it's like, oh, wow, thank you very much. And again, that pretense and not showing people what was really inside of me, because that would have been totally inappropriate, not allowed, to show that I was having problems, severe problems. I did try talking to some elders' wives about it and about my past abuse. And they were like, oh, well, I've never heard of such a thing, and I don't know what to say to you. And there was no support, no help. At the time, people were not allowed to go for therapy. We did try that route eventually, and my husband, after the second time, went, there's something wrong with her, fix her, and everything will be okay, which in his terms meant, as long as I get sex on demand, it's like, no problem. So just get her to change her mind. So I went for the divorce, and that was it. Got the divorce quite easily. And then my mother stopped talking to me. My family stopped talking to me. He remarried, and my family went to his wedding. Wouldn't talk to me, but they all went to his wedding. I was devastated. When they told me I was disfellowshipped, I almost fainted. And during this whole procedure of committees and the disfellowshipping thing, my husband admitted to them his abuse of me. And I think what really hurt was that For 15 years, he had been abusing me behind everyone's back and keeping it a secret. And no, he knew that I was going to go and talk to the elders, so he actually stepped down as elder. Because I think he knew that if they found out all of this, they would have to put him down. So he kind of, the cover-up for him was that I'm spending more time with my family. So, you know, noble, how noble of him. And then I was disfellowshipped, and then everybody for him was like, oh, you poor thing. So he got all of the support and the empathy and everything. And I was left out there drifting. I made one sin in 15 years and was disfellowshipped. He'd been going on for 15 years and got nothing, not even a slap on the wrist. And that really hurt. The other thing, too, with the way the organization works is that since I left, I was the bad guy. He wound up being the good guy, and because he stayed, and as a result married another witness who happened to have 2 daughters who were the same ages apart as mine, or ours were. So it was like God has replaced what was taken away from you. So you've been blessed. So the faithful wind up being rewarded, the unfaithful wind up being expelled, and nobody knows the truth. That my one-time mistake, which turned out to be a rape, wound up being, you know, reason for disfellowshipping. And his 15 years, like, there's not even a note in his files about it. Because I went back about 5 years later to ask about being reinstated, because I was just so lost out in the world. I figured, okay, I'll go back and at least I'll have some friends once I'm reinstated. And I was treated so badly by the elder. And he was one of the elders on the committee, and he says there's nothing in his file about anything that he said. So, like, a total whitewash. And I was treated so badly, I think, because if I went back, they knew I would tell the truth, which meant that I would be sitting there telling them that an elder had been abusing his wife severely and his children while he was an elder, and nobody did anything about it. So it's easier to make sure that I never go back. And I called different congregations, and I got the same, you know, no, very, very nasty responses from people, because I'm a real threat to their version of the truth, that he's the nice guy who never did anything wrong and didn't deserve what happened. Interestingly, his second wife has done the exact same thing, committed adultery so she could get away from him. And that just happened this past year. And I guess she realized what I'd done and decided to take the same route. My children have suffered through all of this. They suffered for all the things they lost while being witnesses, growing up in school and being apart from the other children, not being able to celebrate birthdays and Christmas and other holidays, just not being able to participate in things in school. My youngest daughter I think would have been an extremely talented musician if she'd ever had lessons. But there was no time with that between meetings and service and studying and everything. So that's a huge loss. You know, my older daughter is married now and has a daughter of her own, and she's beginning to celebrate all of the holidays and everything with her daughter. And she says, I'm so sad I missed out on all of these things that just are fun, just nothing horrible about them. And yet as a witness, you're not allowed. So that's painful to listen to, you know, my children talk about what they've missed because of it. And I think there's some anger on their part that, you know, why did I put them through that? And as well, I was just as caught in it as you were. And yeah, it was wrong. It was a terrible way to live. But we're all free now, and we can make other choices for our lives, which is really nice. But, you know, I look at them and the damage And like they stopped going to meetings when they were 8 and 12. Actually a little older, probably 9 and 13. But even as young adults, they still have a harder time integrating into society and knowing what real family and what real caring is, because what you get in the witnesses is very superficial and what is allowed and very controlled, as long as there's conditions on love. And so they're still struggling with some of that in knowing that love is unconditional.
Families are.
I would suspect very high. Just I know it's retrospective and probably doesn't count for very much, but even before I left, I could spot other victims, people who were being abused within the organization. And I know when I was about 13, there was a young girl in the congregation, and I just knew her father was sexually abusing her. Her father was an elder. And I've since learned that I do have an ability to spot other abuse survivors. And I'm dead on, I'd say 99.9% of the time. And later on, it actually came out in the newspapers that it was a big thing out in Canada, that this girl had been abused by her father, an elder, while he was an elder in the congregation. And I was like 13 years old. I spotted her. I knew that she was being abused. So I would say that statistics are, despite the denials of the organization that abuse doesn't exist within the organization, I'd say it's probably rampant, because, who do you go to if you're, it's an old boys gang, even, within the congregations. They're only going to report what doesn't reflect badly on the organization. Let's face it, an elder or any brother in the congregation is abusing his family, it's not going to appear too great if it hits the media. So, and even when I went for counseling, I was told very clearly, don't let them know you're a witness. And yet that's a key element of what was going on in my life. Because if as long as they want to portray this idea that there are no problems in the organization, then going for help and telling people you're a witness is a great big signal that, well, wait a minute, there are problems with witnesses. I've also done work counseling people who are witnesses, and they knew I was an ex-member, but they didn't know where else to go for help and understanding and what they were dealing with. And I guess they figured that I was safe to tell because, as a therapist, I'm under, confidentiality rules. And there are a lot more problems in the organization because of the code of silence that exists and the authoritarian way of structure that, what the top guys say goes. And a lot of fear of going against that.
Few kept in place with their biblical justifications, you might say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Biblical justifications and this whole idea that the organization equals God. And it doesn't. Even though they say it doesn't, the implication is there that they are God's only representative on earth. So if you want to get to God, you've got to go through them. And so therefore they have the power. That's pretty powerful. Jesus even said that, when he was, telling the scribes and Pharisees what he thought of them. The same thing applies to the witnesses. In fact, when I read that the first time, I think it's Matthew 23, and generally the witnesses use that to apply to every other religion. When you take a look at that and apply it to the witnesses themselves, it is truly shocking how similar, how they everything. It's just unbelievable that they do the exact same things that they condemn everybody else for. But then that's typical of all cults. Well, they'll say, like what you can wear. Okay, women cannot wear skirts, an inch above their knee. Well, it's a guiding principle, and you're not going to be disfellowshipped for it. But you're going to be talked to. It's like, wait a minute, is it a principle or is it a rule? If it's a principle, then people should be free to do what they want, to obey the principle or not. If it's a rule, somebody's going to talk to you if you break it. And those kinds of playing with words, it's not a rule, it's a principle, is what gets people caught up a lot, because it's like, well, no, they don't have rules. Well, no, because they've redefined what principle means. And again, that comes back to the mind control techniques, where if I can change the meaning of a word, then and make it mean something that it doesn't mean, but still apply what I want it to mean, like principle, for example, then I can control, and well, principle doesn't mean you're going to be punished. You have free will. But you don't have free will because we'll nail you if you break it. As long as they continue to say, but we don't tell people what to do, then they can absolve themselves of responsibility when people actually break the rules. But they can, by calling it a principle, they can still exert the control without having the responsibility. And therefore they put the responsibility on the individual, but they have the control over them. And it's very subtle, but it's extremely strong. And very few people see. In fact, I don't think any witness actually sees it. Something you asked me earlier was, is this, do people know that they're doing this? Are they aware of the amount of control that they're exerting on people? And I started by saying that the organization had been founded by some really dysfunctional men. And I think that it's been set up in a way by the dysfunction that it kind of perpetuates itself. That the people who are involved now, I think they're so controlled and it's so ingrained in them that they haven't got a clue. And that's similar to you raise up a child in an abusive home and they think that's normal and that's the right way to raise children. They grow up and they beat their kids, and because they think that's normal. And I think that's what's happened in the organization. A couple of people, the founders were dysfunctional. They implant or set up this system, and it has just taken on a life of its own, and everybody in it thinks it's normal. And when somebody comes along and says, hey, wait a minute, there's something wrong here, they wind up, well, excuse me, this is what's normal, we're sticking with it, and goodbye, which is exactly what has happened to a few board members who are able to see the dysfunction in it. I think in any group where there are a lot of rules about what you can and can't do, life becomes a matter of assessing, going through the rules all the time to assess whether what you can do is right or wrong. And you wind up not being able to think clearly for yourself and judge, whether the rule itself is right or wrong, or whether you should obey it or not, but rather there just becomes this rote going through the motions. The effect of this for a lot of people is that they stop thinking, and it's just a matter of, okay, what do the elders say? I have to make a choice about doing something, and I think I need to ask somebody. And a perfect example of this is when my oldest daughter got married. She had left the witnesses. She chose to get married in a Catholic church. And she wanted her father, who's still a witness, to walk her down the aisle. Normally this would not be allowed because it would be considered participating in false religion. And he could not say yes or no by himself. He could not critically think about what he wanted to do, what the rules were. he had to go and ask the elders what he should do in this situation. And most people would just make a choice. And he didn't do that. He went to ask the elders, and I don't know what happened at the meeting, but the justification was that he could do it, but he was just making a delivery. So, so basically what he was going to do, just as if he was the bread man, he was going to make a delivery to a convent, or the church. He was basically just delivering his daughter to her new husband down the aisle. So he actually did walk her down the aisle and deliver her to her new husband, and then he went and he sat at the back of the church and didn't participate in the religious activity. But something as simple as walking somebody down the aisle, he could not figure that out on his own. He had to ask permission, or under what circumstances can I rationalize participating in this function. And a lot of people in cults are reduced to that kind of living by the law rather than being able to think for themselves. And hey, we're thinking human beings. We should be able to see a problem and work it through. And after years of being in a cult, it becomes very difficult for people to actually critically think and assess. And one of the things that happened to me after I came out, shortly after I was disfellowshipped, there was an article in The Awake on child abuse and how the elders should deal with it, and if you had been abused, what to do about it. And when you read through it, it sounds good when you just kind of quickly read through, but there are pieces missing. There was also another article on whether Jehovah's Witnesses were a cult. Now, anybody who, would read it, you would realize that they never answer the question. So they put the question out there, are Jehovah's Witnesses a cult? You read the article, not once do they say, no, we're not a cult. They say, this is what other people think are cults, which is generally they take you off to a commune and brainwash you. They don't let you eat. You're not allowed to talk to anybody. And they say, we don't do that. But nowhere in the article do they really define what a cult is and say, we don't do these things. And if you have the ability still to critically analyze something, you would be able to see that. But once that ability is taken away through the mind control techniques, you read it and it's a blur. You don't read between the lines, because in any of their magazines or their literature, there is more not said than needs to be said. And it's that critical thinking ability that allows people to say, what are they not saying? And that's been taken away. And I know when I came out, going back to school was really difficult, because I had to learn how to critique as I was reading, and to say, well, one of the courses I took was on research, and how do you evaluate the information you get and whether it's correct or not. And very little of the information in the Watchtower or any of the literature is actually correct. I think for people who have come out of any cult, and it's important to find other people who have been in. One idea I really like is to find somebody who's been in a different cult and compare notes. And you'll begin to see, wait a minute, there's an awful lot of similarities here. And the reason for that is that if you go to somebody first from your own cult, that programming to defend them is so strong that whatever they say, you kind of, it gets canceled out. So when you talk to somebody from a different cult and you see the beliefs are the same, the structure is the same, their feelings are the same, you begin to equate that there's something more here. From talking to somebody outside of the group, from a different cult, then move into somebody who has been from the same group and start comparing notes and talking. Read as much as you can get your hands on. And find support groups if there are any. If not, try starting one. A lot of them are popping up all over the place. And then I think it's really important for people to get counseling. And sadly, it's really hard to find. Very, very few people understand the dynamics of abuse, never mind the dynamics of spiritual abuse. And it might basically have to interview therapists and find out if they've read certain books, if they understand abuse dynamics. That would help. If you talk to a minister and he understands abuse dynamics, he might be able to key into this. Ideally, find somebody who's been through cult experience and understands the coming out process. But they might be hard to find. I think we need a lot more research and training to help therapists understand the dynamics of this abuse. There are some fabulous books out there that people can get hold of, and the internet is a gold mine.
Absolutely.
Get on the internet and do your research. There's people out there, there's information galore, and failing that, go to your library and look for information on cults. Well, spiritual abuse can be emotional, physical, psychological, sexual. It can be any of those, but there's an added element of using a higher power, higher authority, God, or however that is defined by a group, whether it's the individual saying, I am God, or, like the witnesses, the governing body is the mediator between people and God. So there's this added element of spirituality or higher power that is used to control and manipulate people. And in doing so, it robs people ultimately of their spirituality. Because if somebody's controlling it, then you don't have your spirituality anymore. Somebody else has it.